Hello. So apologies for last stream right away, get that out of the way. Technical disaster as per usual. And I will I need to be more aware of my settings, I guess. I'm still getting back into it. I know it's the middle of the month, but I haven't been. All right, there we go. I haven't been streaming that much. I haven't been able to. But I will hopefully soon do more. I don't know. We'll see. But for now, we will continue with Edgar Allan Poe. The first one will be Landor's Cottage. Last time we read The Domain of Arnheim, and this is, oh, I will, last time was The Domain of Arnheim, and this is apparently a pendant to The Domain of Arnheim. I don't think that means that it is within the Domain of Arnheim, but just, so we'll read. We'll read about what it is, which is apparently it was his final short work of prose that got published. That was 1849. And unlike the majority of Poe's work, this story is devoid of mystery, murder, and the macabre. Instead, it is a detailed and masterful description of a lone cottage owned by one Mr. Landor. So it will be beautiful descriptions and imagery, much in the same vein as the last half of the Domain of Arnheim. And so we shall see, and that shall be fun. And then afterward, we will read the next one, which is very, very different. So first, here is Landor's Cottage, a pendant to the Domain of Arnheim. Oh. Make sure everything's working. Okay. Fearing of a I did tongue twisters and vocal warm-ups, but sometimes they just don't work properly. Here we go. Landor's Cottage. During a pedestrian tour last summer through one or two of the river counties of New York, I found myself, as the day declined, somewhat embarrassed about the road I was pursuing. The land undulated very remarkably, and my path, for the last hour, had wound about and about so confusedly in its effort to keep in the valleys that I no longer knew in what direction lay the sweet village of B, where I had determined to stop for the night. The sun had scarcely shone, strictly speaking, during the day, which, nevertheless, had been unpleasantly warm. A smoky mist, resembling that of the Indian summer, enveloped all things, and of course added to my uncertainty. Not that I cared much about the matter. If I did not hit upon the village before sunset, or even before dark, it was more than possible that a little Dutch farmhouse, or something of that kind, would soon make its appearance, although in fact the neighborhood, perhaps on account of being more picturesque than fertile, was very sparsely inhabited. At all events, with my knapsack for a pillow, and my hound as a sentry, a bivouac in the open air was just the thing which would have amused me. I sauntered on, therefore, quite at ease, Ponto taking charge of my gun, until at length, just as I had begun to consider whether the numerous little glades that led hither and thither were intended to be paths at all, I was conducted by one of the most promising of them into an unquestionable carriage track. There could be no mistaking it. The traces of light wheels were evident, and although the tall shrubberies and overgrown undergrowth met overhead, there was no obstruction whatever below, even to the passage of a Virginian mountain wagon, the most aspiring vehicle, I take it, of its kind. The road, however, except in being open through the wood, if wood be not too weighty a name of such an assemblage of light trees, and except in the particulars of evident wheel tracks, bore no resemblance to any road I had before seen. The tracks of which I speak were but faintly perceptible, having been impressed upon the firm yet pleasantly moist surface of what looked more like green Genoese velvet than anything else. It was grass, clearly, but grass such as we seldom see out of England, so short, so thick, so even, and so vivid in color. Not a single impediment lay in the wheel route, not even a chip or dead twig. The stones that once obstructed the way had been carefully placed, not thrown, along the sides of the lane, so as to define its boundaries at bottom with a kind of half-precise, half-negligent, and wholly picturesque definition. Clumps of wild flowers grew everywhere, luxuriantly, in the interspaces. What to make of all this, of course I knew not. Here was art, undoubtedly. That did not surprise me. All roads, in the ordinary sense, are works of art. Nor can I say that there was much to wonder at in the mere excess of art manifested. All that seemed to have been done might have been done here, with such natural capabilities, as they have it in the books on landscape gardening, with very little labor and expense. No, it was not the amount, but the character of the art which caused me to take a seat on one of the blossomy stones and gaze up and down this fairy-like avenue for half an hour or more in bewildered admiration. One thing became more and more evident the longer I gazed. An artist, and one with a most scrupulous eye for form, had superintended all these arrangements. The greatest care had been taken to preserve a due medium between the neat and graceful on the one hand, and the pittoresque, in the true sense of the Italian term, on the other. There were few straight and no long uninterrupted lines. The same effect of curvature or of color appeared twice, usually, but not oftener, at any one point of view. Everywhere was variety in uniformity. It was a piece of composition in which the most fastidiously critical taste could scarcely have suggested an emendation. I had turned to the right as I entered this road, and now, arising, I continued in the same direction. The path was so serpentine that at no moment could I trace its course for more than 2 or 3 paces in advance. Its character did not undergo any material change. Presently the murmur of water fell gently upon my ear, and in a few moments afterwards, as I turned with the road somewhat more abruptly than hitherto, I became aware that a building of some kind lay at the foot of a gentle declivity just before me. I could see nothing distinctly on account of the mist which occupied all the little valley below. A gentle breeze, however, now arose as the sun was about descending, and while I remained standing on the brow of the slope, the fog gradually became dissipated into wreaths, and so floated over the scene. As it came fully into view, thus gradually as I describe it, piece by piece, here a tree, there a glimpse of water, and here again the summit of a chimney, I could scarcely help fancying that the whole was one of the ingenious illusions sometimes exhibited under the name of varnishing pictures. By the time, however, that the fog had thoroughly disappeared, the sun had made its way down behind the gentle hills, and thence, as if with a slight chassé to the south, had come again fully into sight. Not quite sure how to pronounce that. Had come again fully into sight, glaring with a purplish luster through a chasm that entered the valley from the west. Suddenly, therefore, and as if by the band of magic, this whole valley and everything in it became brilliantly visible. The first coup d'oeil. Ah, come back! Oh no. I'm sure it's not going to tell me how to pronounce it, but we can at least see what it means. A look. The first look, as the sun slid into the position described, impressed me very much as I have been impressed when a boy, by the concluding scene of some well-arranged theatrical spectacle or melodrama. Not even the monstrosity of color was wanting, for the sunlight came out through the chasm, tinted all orange and purple, while the vivid green of the grass in the valley was reflected more or less upon all objects, from the curtain of vapor that still hung overhead, as if loth to take its total departure from a scene so enchantingly beautiful. The little vale into which I thus I peered down from under the fog canopy, could not have been more than 400 yards long, while in breadth it varied from 50 to 150, or perhaps 200. It was most narrow at its northern extremity, opening out as it tended southwardly, but with no very precise regularity. The widest portion was within 80 yards of the southern extreme. The slopes which encompassed the vale could not fairly be called hills, unless at their northern face. Here a precipitous ledge of granite rose to a height of some 90 feet, and as I have mentioned, the valley at this point was not more than 50 feet wide. But as the visitor proceeded southwardly from this cliff, he found on his right hand and on his left declivities at once less high, less precipitous, and less rocky. All, in a word, sloped and softened to the south, and yet the whole vale was engirdled by eminences, more or less high, except at 2 points. One of these I have already spoken of. It lay considerably to the north of west, and was where the setting sun made its way, as I have before described, into the amphitheatre, through a cleanly cut natural cleft in the granite embankment. This fissure might have been 10 yards wide at its widest point, so far as the eye could trace it. It seemed to lead up, like a natural causeway, into the recesses of unexplored mountains and forests. The other opening was directly at the southern end of the vale. Here, generally, the slopes were nothing more than gentle inclinations, extending from east to west about 150 yards. In the middle of this extent was a depression, level with the ordinary floor of the valley. As regards vegetation, as well as in respect to everything else, the scene softened and sloped to the south. To the north, on the craggy precipice, a few paces from the verge, upsprang the magnificent trunks of numerous hickories, black walnuts, and chestnuts, interspersed with occasional oak, and the strong lateral branches thrown out by the walnuts especially spread far over the edge of the cliff. Proceeding southwardly, the explorer saw at first the same class of trees, but less and less lofty and salvatorish in character. Then he saw the gentler elm, succeeded by the sassafras and locust, these again by the softer linden, redbud, catalpa, and maple, these yet again by still more graceful and more modest varieties. The whole face of the southern declivity was covered with an, wild shrubbery alone, an occasional silver willow or white poplar excepted. In the bottom of the valley itself, for it must be borne in mind that the vegetation hitherto mentioned grew only on the cliffs or hillsides, were to be seen three insulated trees. One was an elm of fine size and exquisite form. It stood guard over the southern gate of the vale. Another was a hickory, much larger than the elm, and altogether a much finer tree, although both were exceedingly beautiful. It seemed to have taken charge of the northwestern entrance, springing from a group of rocks in the very jaws of the ravine, and throwing its graceful body at an angle of nearly 45 degrees far out into the sunshine of the amphitheater. About 30 yards east of this tree stood, however, the pride of the valley, and beyond all question the most magnificent tree I have ever seen, unless perhaps among the cypresses of the Ichthyotucany. It was a triple-stemmed tulip tree, the Liriodendron tulipiferum, one of the natural order of magnolias. Its three trunks, separated from the parent at about 3 feet from the soil, and diverging very slightly and gradually, were not more than 4 feet apart at the point where the largest stem shot out into foliage. This was at an elevation of about 80 feet. The whole height of the principal division was 120 feet. Nothing can surpass in beauty the form, or the glossy, vivid green of the leaves of the tulip tree. In the present instance, they were fully 8 inches wide, but their glory was altogether eclipsed by the gorgeous splendor of the profuse blossoms. Conceive, closely congregated, a million of the largest and most resplendent tulips. Only thus can the reader get any idea of the picture I would convey. And then the stately grace of the clean, delicately granulated columnar stems, the largest 4 feet in diameter, at 20 from the ground. The innumerable blossoms, mingling with those of other trees scarcely less beautiful, although infinitely less majestic, filled the valley with more than Arabian perfumes. The general floor of the amphitheater was grass of the same character as that I had found in the road, if anything more deliciously soft, thick, velvety, and miraculously green. It was hard to conceive how all this beauty had been attained. I have spoken of the 2 openings into the vale. From the one to the northwest issued a rivulet, which came gently murmuring and slightly foaming down the ravine, until it dashed against the group of rocks out of which sprang the insulated hickory. Here, after encircling the tree, it passed on a little to the north of east. It passed on a little to the north of east, leaving the tulip tree some 20 feet to the south, and making no decided alteration in its course until it came near the midway between the eastern and western boundaries of the valley. At this point, after a series of sweeps, it turned off at right angles and pursued a generally southern direction, meandering as it went, until it became lost in a small lake of irregular figure, although roughly oval, that lay gleaming near the lower extremity of the vale. This lakelet was, perhaps, 100 yards in diameter at its widest part. No crystal could be clearer than its waters. Its bottom, which could be distinctly seen, consisted altogether of pebbles brilliantly white. Its banks, of the emerald grass already described, rounded rather than sloped off into the clear heaven below, and so clear was this heaven, so perfectly at times did it reflect all objects above it, that where the true bank ended and where the mimic one commenced, it was a point of no little difficulty to determine. The trout and some other varieties of fish with which this pond seemed to be almost inconveniently crowded had all the appearance of veritable flying fish. It was almost impossible to believe that they were not absolutely suspended in the air. A light birch canoe that lay placidly on the water was reflected in its minutest fibers with a fidelity unsurpassed by the most exquisitely polished mirror. A small island, fairly laughing with flowers in full bloom, and affording little more space than just enough for a picturesque little building, seemingly a fowl house, arose from the lake not far from its northern shore, to which it was connected by means of an inconceivably light-looking and yet very primitive bridge. It was formed of a single broad and thick plank of the tulip wood. This was 40 feet long and spanned the interval between shore and shore with a slight but very perceptible arch, preventing all oscillation. From the southern extreme of the lake issued a continuation of the rivulet, which, after meandering for perhaps 30 yards, finally passed through the depression already described in the middle of the southern declivity, and tumbling down a sheer precipice of 100 feet, made its devious and unnoticed way to the Hudson. The lake was deep, at some points 30 feet, but the rivulet seldom exceeded 3, while its greatest width was about 8. Its bottom and banks were as those of the pond. If a defect could have been attributed to them, in point of picturesqueness, it was that of excessive neatness. The expanse of the green turf was relieved, here and there, by an occasional showy shrub, such as the hydrangea, or the common snowball, or the aromatic syringia, or more frequently by a clump of geraniums blossoming gorgeously in great varieties. These latter grew in pots which were carefully buried in the soil so as to give the plants the appearance of being indigenous. Besides all this, the lawn's velvet was exquisitely spotted with sheep, a considerable flock of which roamed about the vale, in company with 3 tamed deer, and a vast number of brilliantly plumed ducks. A very large mastiff seemed to be in vigilant attendance upon these animals, each and all. Along the eastern and western cliffs, where, towards the upper portion of the amphitheater, the boundaries were more or less precipitous, grew ivy in great profusion, so that only here and there could even a glimpse of the naked rock be obtained. The northern precipice, in like manner, was almost entirely clothed by grapevines of rare luxuriance, some springing from the soil at the base of the cliff, and others from ledges on its face. The slight elevation which formed the lower boundary of this little domain was crowned by a neat stone wall of sufficient height to prevent the escape of the deer. Nothing of the fence kind was observable elsewhere, for nowhere else was an artificial enclosure needed. Any stray sheep, for example, which should attempt to make its way out of the vale by means of the ravine, would find its progress arrested after a few yards' advance by the precipitous ledge of rock over which tumbled the cascade that had arrested my attention as I first drew near the domain. In short, the only ingress or egress was through a grate occupying a rocky pass in the road, a few paces below the point at which I stopped to reconnoiter the scene. I have described the brook as meandering very irregularly through the whole of its course. Its 2 general directions, as I have said, were first from west to east, and then from north to south. At the turn, the stream, sweeping backwards, made an almost circular loop, so as to form a peninsula which was very nearly an island, and which included about the 16th of an acre. On this peninsula stood a dwelling house, and when I say that this house, like the infernal terrace seen by Vathek, I'm going to translate this, was of an architecture unknown in the annals of the earth, I mean merely that its entire assembly altogether that it altogether struck me with the keenest sense of combined novelty and propriety, in a word, of poetry, for then in the words just employed, I could scarcely give, of poetry in the abstract, a more rigorous definition. And I do not mean that the merely outer was perceptible in any respect. The merely unusual was perceptible in any respect. This is why I translate. In fact, nothing could well be more simple, more utterly unpretending than this cottage. Its marvelous effect lay altogether in its artistic arrangement as a picture. I could have fancied, while I looked at it, that some eminent landscape painter had built it with his brush. The point of view from which I first saw the valley was not altogether, although it was nearly the best point from which to survey the house. I will therefore describe it as I afterwards saw it, from a position on the stone wall at the southern extreme of the amphitheater. The main building was about 24 feet long and 16 broad, certainly not more. Its total height from the ground to the apex of the roof could not have exceeded 18 feet. To the west end of this structure was attached one about a third smaller in all its proportions, the line of its front standing back about 2 yards from that of the larger house, and the line of its roof, of course, being considerably depressed below that of the roof adjoining. At right angles to these buildings, and from the rear of the main one, not exactly in the middle, extended a third compartment, very small, being in general 1/3 less than the western wing. The roofs of the 2 larger were very steep, sweeping down from the ridge beam with a low concave curve, and extending at least 4 feet beyond the walls in front, so as to form the roofs of 2 piazzas. These latter roofs, of course, needed no support, but as they had the air of needing it, slight and perfectly plain pillars were inserted at the corners alone. The roof of the northern wing was merely an extension of a portion of the main roof. Between the chief building and western wing arose a very tall and rather slender square chimney of hard Dutch bricks, alternately black and red, a slight cornice of projecting bricks at the top. Over the gables, the roofs also projected very much. In the main building, about 4 feet to the east and 2 to the west. The principal door was not exactly in the main division, being a little to the east, while the two windows were to the west. These latter did not extend to the floor, but were much longer and narrower than usual. They had single shutters like doors. Panes were of lozenge form, but quite large. The door itself had its upper half of glass, also in lozenge panes. A movable shutter secured it at night. The door to the west wing was in its gable, and quite simple. A single window looked out to the south. There was no external door to the north wing, and it also had only one window to the east. The blank wall of the eastern gable was relieved by stairs, with a balustrade running diagonally across it, the ascent being from the south. Under cover of the widely projecting eave, these steps gave access to a door leading into the garret, or rather loft, for it was lighted only by a single window to the north, and seemed to have been intended as a storeroom. The piazzas of the main building and western wing had no floors, as is usual, but at the doors and at each window, large, flat, irregular slabs of granite lay embedded in the delicious turf, affording comfortable footing in all weather. Excellent paths of the same material, not nicely adapted, but with the velvety sod filling frequent intervals between the stones, led hither and thither from the house, to a crystal spring about 5 paces off, to the road, or to one or two outhouses that lay to the north, beyond the brook, and were thoroughly concealed by a few locusts and catalpas. Not more than 6 steps from the main door of the cottage stood the dead trunk of a fantastic pear tree, so clothed from head to foot in the gorgeous bignon, big, bignonia, or is that how you spell begonia? Bignonia blossoms that one required no little scrutiny to determine what manner of sweet thing it could be. From various arms of this tree hung cages of different kinds. In one, a large wicker cylinder with a ring at top, revelled a mockingbird; in another, an oriole; in a third, the impudent bobolink; while 3 or 4 more delicate prisons were loudly vocal with canaries. The pillars of the piazza were enwreathed in jasmine and sweet honeysuckle, while from the angle formed by the main structure and its west wing, in front, sprang a grapevine of unexampled luxuriance. Scorning all restraint, it had clambered first to the lower roof, then to the oh my! First to the lower roof, then to the higher, and along the ridge of this latter it continued to writhe on, throwing out tendrils to the right and left, until at length it fairly attained the east gable, and fell trailing over the stairs. The whole house, with its wings, was constructed of the old-fashioned Dutch shingles, broad and with unrounded corners. It is a peculiarity of this material to give houses built of it the appearance of being wider at bottom than at top, after the manner of Egyptian architecture, and in the present instance this exceedingly picturesque effect was aided by numerous pots of gorgeous flowers that almost encompassed the base of the buildings. The shingles were painted a dull gray, and the happiness with which this neutral tint melted into the vivid green of the tulip tree leaves that partially overshadowed the cottage can readily be conceived by an artist. From the position near the stone wall, as described, the buildings were seen at great advantage, for the southeastern angle was thrown forward, so that the eye took in at once the whole of the 2 fronts, with the picturesque eastern gable, and at the same time obtained just a sufficient glimpse of the northern wing, with parts of a pretty roof to the spring house, and nearly half of a light bridge that spanned the brook in the near vicinity of the main buildings. I did not remain very long on the brow of the hill, although long enough to make a thorough survey of the scene at my feet. It was clear that I had wandered from the road to the village, and I had thus good traveller's excuse to open the gate before me and inquire my way, at all events. So, without more ado, I proceeded. The road, after passing the gate, seemed to lie upon a natural ledge, sloping gradually down along the face of the northeastern cliffs. It led me on to the foot of the northern precipice, and thence over the bridge, round by the eastern gable to the front door. In this progress, I took notice that no sight of the outhouses could be obtained. As I turned the corner of the gable, the mastiff bounded towards me in stern silence, but with the eye and the whole air of a tiger. I held him out my hand, however, in token of amity, and I never yet knew the dog who was proof against such an appeal to his courtesy. He not only shut his mouth and wagged his tail, but absolutely offered me his paw, afterwards extending his civilities to Ponto. As no bell was discernible, I rapped with my stick against the door, which stood half open. Instantly a figure advanced to the threshold, that of a young woman about 28 years of age, slender or rather slight, and somewhat above the medium height. As she approached with a certain modest decision of step altogether indescribable, I said to myself, surely here I have found the perfection of natural, in contradistinction from artificial grace. The second impression which she made on me, but by far the more vivid of the two, was that of enthusiasm, so intense an expression of romance, perhaps I should call it, or of unworldliness, as that which gleamed from her deep-set eyes, had never so sunk into my heart of hearts before. I know not how it is, but this peculiar expression of the eye, wreathing itself occasionally into the lips, is the most powerful, if not absolutely the sole spell which rivets my interest in woman. Romance, provided my readers fully comprehend what I would here imply by the word. Romance and womanliness seem to me convertible terms, and after all, what man truly loves in woman is simply her womanhood. The eyes of Annie, I heard someone from the interior call her Annie darling, were spiritual gray, her hair a light chestnut. This is all I had time to observe of her. At her most courteous of invitations, I entered, passing first into a tolerably wide vestibule. Having come mainly to observe, I took notice that to my right, as I stepped in, was a window, such as those in front of the house, to the left a door leading into the principal room, while opposite me an open door enabled me to see a small apartment, just the size of the vestibule, arranged as a study and having a large bow window looking out to the north. Passing into the parlor, I found myself with Mr. Landor, for this I afterwards found was his name. He was civil, even cordial in his manner, but just then I was more intent on observing the arrangements of the dwelling, which had so much interested me, than the personal appearance of the tenant. The north wing, I now saw, was a bedchamber. Its door opened into the parlor. West of this door was a single window, looking towards the brook. At the west end of the parlor were a fireplace and a door leading into the west wing, probably a kitchen. Nothing could be more rigorously simple than the furniture of the parlor. On the floor was an ingrain carpet of excellent texture, a white ground spotted with small circular green figures. At the windows were curtains of snowy white jaconet muslin. They were tolerably full and hung decisively, perhaps rather formally, in sharp parallel plates to the floor, just to the floor. The walls were papered with a French paper of great delicacy, silver ground, with a faint green cord running zigzag throughout. Its expanse was relieved merely by three of Julien's exquisite lithographs. Sorry. Très clair. Hang on, translating. Has three pencils. Its expanse was relieved merely by three of Julien's exquisite lithographs of three pencils, fastened to the wall without frames. I, I guess I would assume that it was a work of art done with three colors. One of these drawings was a scene of oriental luxury, or rather voluptuousness. Another was a carnival piece, spirited beyond compare. The third was a Greek female head, a face so divinely beautiful, and yet of an expression so provokingly indeterminate, never before arrested my attention. The more substantial furniture consisted of a round table, a few chairs, including a large rocking chair, and a sofa, or rather settee. Its material was plain maple, painted a creamy white, slightly interstriped with green, the seed of cane. The chairs and table were to match, but the forms of all had evidently been designed by the same brain which planned the grounds. It is impossible to conceive anything more graceful. On the table were a few books, a large square crystal bottle of some novel perfume, a plain ground glass astral, not solar, lamp with an Italian shade, and a large vase of resplendently blooming flowers. Flowers, indeed, of gorgeous colors and delicate odor, formed the sole mere decoration of the apartment. The fireplace was nearly filled with a vase of brilliant geranium. On a triangular shelf in each angle of the room stood also a similar vase, varied only as to its lovely contents. One or two smaller bouquets adorned the mantel, and late violets clustered about the open windows. It is not the purpose of this work to do more than give, in detail, a picture of Mr. Landor's residence as I found it. Oh, I enjoyed that. um, Again, this is one of those that I would probably have to read again in order to get the full effect of it and really imagine it, picture it in my own mind. Um, but yeah, for I wonder, as someone who does writing myself, how I'm less detailed than I am the more general. So all the details that come from here, I always wonder where they came from. Were they from his own experiences, or did he just come up with them? And then to be able to bring it all together into this one beautiful image of one place. Yeah, it was beautiful. It was lovely. It was serene. um, it was again slightly different than I expected of it. I was expecting a little more of the domain of Arnheim, where it was a little bit more fairy tale esque. Um, but I did. This was nice. It was very realistic while also saying it wasn't realistic. Yeah, it was fun. It was interesting. So that was Landor's Cottage. I will find the next one, which I have to skip over this one because it is long. That will be for next time. So the next one is, I was going to look up whether I'm supposed to say Bernice or if it's Berenice. I'm just going to say Berenice. Berenice? Berenice? I'm not sure. So we're going from, as the title said, serenity to violence, basically. Because this one is about, one moment, let me find it. Sure, everything's going okay, I hope. Berenice is short horror story by Edgar Allan Poe, 1835. Aegis, who is preparing to marry his cousin Berenice, tends to fall into periods of intense focus, during which he seems to separate himself from the outside world. Berenice begins to deteriorate from an unnamed disease until only her teeth remain healthy. Aegis obsesses over them. And I'm going to stop there with that description because, again, it almost seems like it gives the whole story away, but I'm always surprised with Poe. So, and yeah, one of the things that it says is that readers were surprised by its violence. So we'll be going from that tranquility to uh more what I guess Poe is known for is the dark and macabre. So this is Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe. And this is the translation. I hope it is. Oh no, I hope it's okay. They said to me, members to be a grave are glad of visit. Hang on, I'm gonna find what a better translation of that, just so that we know what it actually means. Um, ba-ba-ba-da-bum. Nope. I'm sorry. I should have looked at this better. Uh, um, oh. Ah, um, hello. Hi, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to translate the first bit of Latin of this next story. I should have looked, but yeah. Oh, it might be this. It might be this. Okay, here we go. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Cyan, blah, blah, blah. Ah, maybe it isn't. One second. I did. I thought I had everything figured out. Uh, okay, here we go. Um, so this I will not try to pronounce it by Ibn Zayat. Uh, it's maybe translated as, "My companion said to me, if I would visit the grave of my friend, I might somewhat alleviate my worries." Okay. So this is Berenice, if you've just shown up. And the one we just read before was a very tranquil, very serene imagery, picturesque of a cottage, and this one is apparently a bit more macabre, horrific. So there's that. So Aegis is going to marry uh, his cousin, which was at that time a thing. Um, but then she comes down with a disease, and her everything that remains healthy is her teeth, and he becomes obsessed with them. So that's where that is. So Berenice, here we go. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform, overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. Its hues are as various as the hues of that arch, as distinct too, yet as intimately blended, overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness, from the covenant of peace a simile of sorrow? But as in ethics evil is a consequence of good, so in fact out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been. I like that. Oops. Ah, there. My baptismal name is Aegis. That of my family I will not mention, yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy, gray, hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollection of my earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with its volumes, of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother. Herein was I born. But it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sounds musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow, too, in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber was I born, thus awaking from the long night of what seemed, but was not, nonentity, at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a palace of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away my boyhood in books, and dissipated my youth in reverie. But it is singular that as years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful what stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became, in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew. I, ill of health and buried in gloom. She, agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers, the ramble on the hillside. Mine, the studies of the cloister. I, living within my own heart, and addicted, body and soul, to the most intense and painful meditation. She, roaming carelessly through life, with no thought of the shadows in her path, or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice, I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the gray ruins of memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Ah, vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her lightheartedness and joy. O gorgeous yet fantastic beauty, O sylph amid the shrubberies of Arnheim, O naiad among its fountains, and then all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoon upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where is she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in its nature, a species of epilepsy not unfrequently terminating in trance itself, trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was, in most instances, startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease then grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigor, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. To muse for long unwearied hours, with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin or in the topography of a book, become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the floor, to lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, cease to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence, by means of absolute bodily quiescence long and obstinately persevered in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries, induced by a condition of the mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Sorry? Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue, earnest, and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might be at first supposed, an extreme condition or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer, or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, until at the conclusion of a daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the incitamentum, the incentive. He finds the incentive, or first cause of his musings, entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming, through the medium of my distempered vision, a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as a center. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were, with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are, with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate the disorder, partook, it will be perceived, largely in their imaginative and inconsequential nature, of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I well remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian, Quellius Secundus Curio, of amplitude, beauty, um, royalty, and deity. The amplitude of rain. Sure. St. Austin's great work, The City of God, and Tertullian's De Carne Christi. Oops. Oh no, where'd it go? Oops. De Carne Christi. Like it would be Latin. Well, carne is meat of Christ. So the body of Christ, probably. The City of God and Tertullian's The Body of Christ, in which the paradoxical sentence, mortuus et Dei filius, he died of his son. Oops, there's more. Okay, the paradoxical sentence, he died of his son, it is believable because it is imposed, and was resurrected because it is impossible. 2. Okay. occupied my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken by Ptolemy Hephaestion, which steadily resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiercer fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity, indeed, gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder, frequently and bitterly, upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder reveled in the less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the gray of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a being of the earth, earthy, but as the abstraction of such a being, not as a thing to admire, but to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse, although desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach. Yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful Halcyon, there's a star, so we'll go look at it. For as Jove during the winter season gives twice 7 days of warmth, men have called this clement and temperate time the nurse of the beautiful Halcyon, by Simonides. Beautiful Halcyon. I sat, and sat as I thought, alone, in the inner apartment of the library, but uplifting my eyes, I saw that Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the gray draperies which fell around her figure, that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, not for worlds could I have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. A sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon the face. The forehead was high and very pale and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets, now of a vivid yellow and jarring discordantly, in their fantastic character, with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lustreless, and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I had never beheld them, or that, having done so, I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber. But from the disordered chamber of my brain had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges, but what that brief period of her smile had sufficed to brand in upon my memory. I saw them now even more unequivocally than I beheld them then. The teeth, the teeth, they were here and there and everywhere, and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them, as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them, in imagination, sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Stahl, it has been well said um, that all his steps were feelings, and of Berenice I more seriously believed all her steps were ideas, that all his teeth, that all her teeth were ideas. Ah, here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me, the ideas. Ah, therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace in giving me back to reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus. Then the darkness came, and tarried, and went, and the day again dawned. And the mists of a second night were now gathering around, and still I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, as, with the most vivid and hideous distinctness, it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry as of horror and dismay, and thereunto after a pause succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now, at the closing in of the night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replete with horror, horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I'm going to highlight that because I like that as well. And hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strive to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how came it there, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ebn Zayat. But what it was, my friend told me to grave of my My companion said to me, if I would visit the grave of my friend, I might somewhat alleviate my worries. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed within my veins? There came a light tap at the library door, and, pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound. And then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces, and from it with a rattling sound there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white, and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. So, in sorry, my yeah, right, my wrist cracked. Anyway, I am always surprised by Poe, and then he ends it just like that. So I read in reading about it so that I would know about what it was about. I read that he ends up pulling the teeth out, going to the grave and digging it up and pulling the teeth out. And so I was anticipating that. And then when it was getting down to it, I was wondering because it said too that people were shocked by the violence of it. And I didn't really, I was thinking it seemed like it wasn't going to a place where it was going to click like that with me, I guess. But I've, yeah, I have a certain threshold for that sort of thing. So I thought it might have just been me. But it was just, I'm not quite sure what makes it. It's so subtle that makes it so horrific. Because, so for one, so she's still alive. I didn't realize that. That's a theme within his stories, but oh my gosh. So just imagining that he digs her up, she's still alive, and he just plucks all the teeth out while she's screaming and trying to make him stop. Oh, so yes. So I was thinking that I was going to be in I mean, I'm yeah. I know. um so yeah, so I'm not appalled by any means. But I mean it did. It worked. It worked very well. And again, it is that subtlety that makes it um that much more horrific, as well as I would even say too, having done the serene, the tranquil, the beautiful imagery into this sort of a thing, that contrast in it. Because right now I'm reading Beowulf, translated by Tolkien, as well for um, my own personal reading thing, and that too, it's not, it's nothing that I haven't read or seen before, but the contrast between the duty and the honor and the propriety of it to those descriptions of gore and horror. So, yes, that again, the contrast as well as the subtlety, the not overdoing it, which I think is a huge problem with things today, is people, I mean, in general of things, there's too much of things. You have to find a happy medium, a balance with them. Um, Otherwise, it overloads whatever sense it is, whether it's reading, whether it's like, it's, I guess even like food, like sugar. If there's too much sugar, you get a stomach ache, right? So anything in that respect, too much of a good thing. So again, that's why I think Poe does so well, is because he's very macabre, but he also has that grasp of beautiful imagery, which then he can apply to horrific imagery, and also that subtlety. So that contrast, as well as that subtlety, not overdoing it, doing it just enough, and then leaving you hanging, which again is just enough. Ugh. So that was fun. That was good. I did. I liked having the beautiful imagery in the beginning, and I did enjoy getting back to the little bit more twisted Poe. Yes, I hope you enjoyed that as well. So yes, that was Berenice. That was Berenice. Before was Landor's Cottage. That was Poe. I will do the little transition thing. Oops, oops, not that one. Da da da. Poe. Yay. Uh, yes, if that was a little horrific, we could just go back and do Landor's Cottage again. It's nice, it's beautiful, serene. But other than that, oh yes, I I will hopefully either Thursday or Friday be able to stream again. It will hopefully be another game if I can figure out how to not make it a technical disaster like last time. Um, but otherwise, the next reading, if I can't get the technical stuff to work, will be William Wilson. I'm not sure at all what that's going to be, but we will find out later at that point. Either, again, hopefully Thursday or Friday, or else next week. And yes, we shall see. So I'm so happy to have had you here. Um, anyone else, I don't know, whoever got lost and found their way here, or who found your way back, thank you. I appreciate it. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Have a good whatever it's going to be for you. And yes, thank you. And yep, you too. Thank you so much. So, bye.